It was a routine night flight across Southeast Asia. At 37,000 feet, the sky above Indonesia looked calm, clear, silent, and uneventful. Then, without warning, the unthinkable happened. One engine coughed and died. Within seconds, another followed, then another, until finally all four of the Boeing 747's massive Rolls-Royce engines went silent. A jet carrying 263 people had become a powerless glider plunging toward the Indian Ocean with no guarantee of restart. In the cockpit, 3 men faced a crisis no airline crew had ever trained for. Could skill and composure outmatch a force no pilot had ever been trained to face? This is the story of British Airways Flight 9. At first, the night seemed ordinary. British Airways Flight 9, a Boeing 747 bound for Perth, was cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet. Outside the cabin windows stretched a moonless sky, black, endless, and deceptively calm. The aircraft, nicknamed City of Edinburgh, carried 248 passengers and 15 crew members. Inside, the atmosphere was typical of a long-haul night leg: dimmed lights, passengers reading or dozing, flight attendants moving quietly through the aisles. Nothing suggested danger. Then the first signs appeared, subtle yet sinister. The cockpit windscreen began to shimmer with a ghostly white glow, like 1,000 stars crawling across the glass. The pilots recognized it as something similar to St. Elmo's fire, an electrical phenomenon usually seen in thunderstorms, but their weather radar showed nothing. Clear skies, no storms. Moments later, the engines themselves seemed to join the strange display. A strobing, bluish light pulsed from the nacelles, giving the appearance of sparks bursting into the night. In the cabin, passengers began to notice an acrid, sulfur-like smell drifting through the air conditioning system. Some thought it was smoke. Others whispered about fire. Yet there was no alarm, no explanation. The cockpit crew exchanged uneasy glances. Their instruments insisted nothing was wrong, yet their senses told them otherwise. Strange light, strange smell, strange silence from the radar. They were flying through something invisible, something their technology could not see. At 800 hours, 42 minutes local time, the mystery deepened into a crisis. One of the 4 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines coughed, surged violently, then quit. The crew shut it down, following standard procedure. A single engine failure on a 747 was serious but survivable. The aircraft could continue safely on 3, but before they could regroup, a second engine failed. Then, almost instantly, the remaining 2 flamed out. Within less than a minute, the world's safest, most advanced airliner had been transformed into a 350-ton glider. The roar of 4 jet engines was replaced by an eerie, hollow silence. Passengers stared out the windows in disbelief as the lights flickered. The horizon tilted slightly downward, and deep in the cockpit, a flight engineer's stunned words cut through the darkness. "I don't believe it. All 4 engines have failed." But what could bring down 4 engines at once on a clear night? The aircraft at the center of this unfolding nightmare was no ordinary machine. British Airways Flight 009, the City of Edinburgh, was a Boeing 747-236B, one of the technological marvels of its era. Capable of flying thousands of miles nonstop, its 4 Rolls-Royce engines had carried millions of passengers safely across the globe. On this night, it had departed Kuala Lumpur for the 5-hour leg to Perth, a routine segment of a much longer journey from London to Auckland. The crew commanding the flight were equally formidable. In the left-hand seat was Captain Eric Moody, 41 years old, calm and precise. Moody had logged more than 17,000 hours in the air. Known for his dry humor and measured communication, he embodied the steady professionalism passengers trusted but rarely noticed. Beside him sat First Officer Roger Greaves, 32, younger but sharp, with a reputation for technical fluency and quick decision-making. He was the kind of pilot who thrived under pressure, an invaluable counterbalance to Moody's quiet authority. Completing the team was flight engineer Barry Townley Freeman, 40, a man with an encyclopedic knowledge of the aircraft's systems. In an era before digital automation, the engineer was the technical anchor, constantly monitoring gauges, flows, and performance. Townley Freeman's expertise would prove decisive. Together, the trio formed a rare blend: experience, technical skill, and calm instinct. Yet fate would soon test that synergy to its breaking point. What made their teamwork remarkable was not simply training, but instinctive trust. Each man's role complemented the others. Moody's composure set the tone, Greaves supplied rapid problem-solving, and Townley Freeman's technical mastery grounded their decisions in hard data. Where many crews might have fallen into confusion or silence, this team leaned into communication, sharing observations openly, weighing each option aloud. This was, in effect, crew resource management, a philosophy of cooperation that had not yet been formalized across airlines in 1982. Yet on Flight 9, it was already alive in practice. It would become their most powerful weapon against the unknown. As passengers reclined in the darkened cabin, unaware of what lay ahead, these three men guided the city of Edinburgh deeper into an invisible hazard. They did not yet know what they were facing, or why their instruments showed nothing unusual, but they could feel it in their bones. The calm night was about to test every hour of their experience. Unknown to the crew of Flight 9, 110 miles ahead and far below their cruising altitude, a volcano was stirring. Mount Galunggung in West Java had erupted multiple times in 1982, its ash plumes blasting as high as 16 kilometers into the atmosphere. On June 24th, it erupted again, its ninth major outburst that year. A column of ash drifted silently across the sky, invisible to those who would soon fly straight into it. Volcanic ash is not like storm clouds. It contains no water droplets, only microscopic fragments of rock, glass, and crystalline material. Standard weather radar, designed to detect moisture, simply showed nothing. To the pilots of Flight 9, the skies ahead appeared perfectly clear. They were, in reality, flying blind into a geological trap. The first clues were sensory, not technological. A faint white glow began to dance across the cockpit windscreen, tiny star-like flickers that shimmered along the edges of the glass. At first, it resembled the atmospheric discharge known as Saint Elmo's fire, a phenomenon familiar to seasoned pilots, but the effect soon intensified. The glow spread across the entire windshield until it looked as though the aircraft were plunging through a field of sparks. The engines joined in the display. Pale blue halos flickered around the nacelles, casting an unearthly glow into the night. From inside the cabin, passengers saw flashes of light rippling along the wings like arcs of static. Some reached for cameras, others exchanged anxious looks. Then came the smell. A bitter, acrid odor of sulfur drifted through the ventilation system. Some passengers thought it was smoke. Others whispered about fire in the cargo hold. Flight attendants moved through the aisles trying to calm nerves. In the cockpit, Moody and his crew puzzled over the contradiction. Their radar showed nothing. Their instruments remained steady. Yet their senses told them they were flying through something alive with energy. They would soon learn the truth, but not before their aircraft was put through a trial no simulator had ever imagined. The first failure came without warning. At 1:42 p.m. UTC, engine number 4 surged violently. The crew heard a sharp bang, followed by flames spitting from the intake. Seconds later, it flamed out completely. Captain Moody and his team reacted instantly, performing the standard shutdown drill. A single engine loss was manageable. The 747 was designed to operate safely on 3. But before they could stabilize the situation, engine number 2 failed. Within seconds, the unthinkable unfolded. Engines 1 and 3 coughed, surged, and died almost simultaneously. The mighty city of Edinburgh, once powered by 4 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, now glided silently through the night. In the cockpit, flight engineer Townley Freeman broke the stunned silence with a disbelieving cry. "I don't believe it, all 4 engines have failed." The sudden quiet was chilling. The roar of 200 tons of thrust had vanished. replaced by the hollow rush of wind over the fuselage. In the cabin, passengers felt the change immediately. The deep vibration that had carried them across the skies was gone. Many described it later as a silence so absolute it was terrifying. Fear spread quickly. Some passengers began to pray. Others wrote farewell notes to loved ones. Yet in the cockpit, Captain Moody kept his composure. Picking up the intercom, he addressed the cabin in words that would later be remembered as a masterclass in understatement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you are not in too much distress." It was a calm mask over a desperate reality. At 37,000 feet with no engines and no procedure for total failure, the crew had roughly 23 minutes of glide time before the ocean would rise to meet them. Could skill, persistence, and sheer luck stretch those minutes into survival? A Boeing 747 is not designed to be a glider. Yet stripped of power at 37,000 feet, that is exactly what British Airways Flight 9 had become, a 350-ton airframe silently slicing through the night. The crew quickly calculated its glide ratio, about 15-to-1. For every 1,000 feet of altitude lost, the aircraft could travel 15 kilometers forward. From 37,000 feet, that gave them roughly 91 nautical miles, or about 23 minutes before the sea below consumed them. The numbers were precise but merciless. Every second that ticked by narrowed their options, then a fresh emergency. At 26,000 feet, the pressurization horn blared. The cabin air had thinned too far. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. In the cockpit, Roger Greaves grabbed his, but the mask disintegrated in his hands. He was left with no oxygen supply. Captain Moody faced a brutal choice: descend slowly to conserve glide distance and risk losing his co-pilot to hypoxia, or dive steeply, trading altitude for breathable air. He chose the latter. The 747 plunged at nearly 6,000 feet per minute, an emergency descent that shaved precious minutes off their glide clock but kept his first officer alive. Meanwhile, the cabin was sliding toward despair. Many passengers began scribbling farewell notes in the dim light. Convinced these were their last words, parents clutched children, couples held hands. The silence, broken only by the rush of wind, made the moment feel like suspended time. Back in the cockpit, the crew worked feverishly through checklists, but nowhere on any page was a procedure for all 4 engines lost. Boeing had never written one. No airline had ever trained for it. The crew were flying in a situation the aviation world had not imagined. 20 minutes of glide left. No engines, no checklist, no guarantees. Would their improvisation make up for what the manuals could not provide? With altitude bleeding away, the crew began desperate restart attempts, yet they knew the odds. The recommended relight envelope for the RB211 engines was above 28,000 feet. They were already thousands of feet below that threshold. Logic said the engines were gone for good, but they tried anyway. One cycle after another, Moody and Townley Freeman coaxed the lifeless turbines, adjusting fuel flows, ignition, and airflow. Nothing. The silence stretched. The altimeter wound downward. Each failed attempt weighed heavily in the cockpit. Every second that passed was one less chance, one more reminder that the ocean below was drawing closer. Still, they refused to surrender, their persistence the only weapon left against physics. What no one realized was that physics itself was quietly working on their side. Inside each engine, molten volcanic ash had coated turbine vanes with a glassy crust. As the aircraft descended into cooler air, those deposits began to cool, harden, and fracture. Invisible cracks formed across the ceramic-like surface, setting the stage for a miracle. At 13,500 feet, the breakthrough came. Engine number 4 sputtered, coughed, and roared weakly back to life. Moody steadied the aircraft with its meager thrust, buying time. Moments later, Engine 3 followed, its turbine shaking off shards of brittle ash. Then, against every probability, engines 1 and 2 relit as well. The silence was broken by a roar of power. Flight 9, once a glider spiraling toward oblivion, was suddenly a living machine again. Relief rippled through the cabin. Some passengers wept openly. But survival was far from certain. The engines were fragile, coughing with residual ash, their power unreliable. And ahead lay Jakarta, their only viable airport. There was just one problem. The cockpit windscreen had been sandblasted to an opaque haze. The crew could barely see outside. Survival in the sky did not mean safety on the ground. The engines, though sputtering alive, were fragile. Each restart had been a gamble. Each surge threatened to fail again. But there was no choice. Ahead lay Jakarta's Halim Perdanakusuma Airport, the only runway within range. The crew prepared for landing. Then came the next impossible challenge. As the 747 descended toward the city, the crew realized their windscreen had been sandblasted into near opacity. The volcanic ash had etched the cockpit glass into a milky blur. At night, with runway lights ahead, the glare would make forward visibility almost non-existent. Moody and his crew were tasked with the unthinkable, landing a jumbo jet essentially blind. To make matters worse, the Instrument Landing System, ILS, at Halim was only partially functioning. The lateral guidance, the localizer, was available, but the vertical component, the glide slope, was inoperative. That meant no automated glide path. Without outside visibility, they had to invent their own solution. Here, the crew's synergy shone. First Officer Greaves turned to the aircraft's distance measuring equipment, DME, which gave readouts of distance from the runway. Using published altitude checks, he built a virtual glide slope in real time, calling out precise altitude targets at each distance marker. Moody, blind ahead, trusted Greaves's cadence completely, flying the descent on instruments and instinct. The aircraft lined up, the altimeter unwound, the cabin braced. At the threshold, Moody eased the throttles and flared. Through the sandblasted haze, the runway lights bloomed at the last second. The city of Edinburgh slammed onto the tarmac, firm but safe. The danger wasn't over. On the taxiway, the floodlights from the apron refracted across the ruined windscreen, creating a blinding glare. The crew had to stop the jet short, unable to taxi further, but none of that mattered. They were down. All 263 souls alive. On the ramp, as passengers filed out in stunned relief, Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman stepped onto the tarmac, dropped to his knees, and kissed the ground. The nightmare was over. Inspection of the aircraft revealed the scale of the ordeal. Paint had been stripped from its nose cone and wings. Leading edges were scarred. The engines were choked with ash damage, their blades eroded and sensors clogged. The cockpit glass was frosted white, opaque even at arm's length. The Boeing 747 was still in one piece, but only just. Remarkably, not a single life had been lost, and that fact carried legal weight. Officially, Flight 9 was not classified as an accident, but as an incident, since no fatalities or serious injuries occurred. It was a technicality, but one that underscored the professionalism that had carried everyone through. For the passengers who walked away from Jakarta that night, the distinction between accident and incident was meaningless. They had lived through what felt like certain death. For the aviation world, however, definitions mattered, and the outcome helped focus attention on lessons rather than blame. The legacy of the flight was immediate and profound. Aviation authorities had never fully understood volcanic ash as a threat. That changed overnight. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, published its first dedicated report on volcanic hazards in 1984, recommending counterintuitive but life-saving procedures: reduce thrust to idle, descend, and exit the ash cloud quickly rather than powering through. This guidance ran against a pilot's instincts, but Flight 9 proved that counterintuitive choices could mean survival. Equally important was detection. 9 volcanic ash advisory centers, VAACs, were established worldwide, tasked with monitoring eruptions in real time and issuing warnings to aircraft. Today, every pilot flying near volcanic regions relies on those alerts, an infrastructure born directly from Flight 9. The eruption of Mount Galunggung had exposed a blind spot in aviation. The creation of VAACs filled it permanently. Another lesson came in human form. The calm, cooperative communication between Moody, Greaves, and Townley Freeman became a case study in crew resource management (CRM). Though CRM was not yet formally mandated, Flight 9 demonstrated its power: open communication, trust, and improvisation under pressure. Their teamwork showed that aviation safety was not only about machines, but about the humans guiding them. Future generations of pilots would study their performance as proof that even in chaos, discipline, and dialogue could hold a flight together. The survival of Flight 9 reshaped the aviation world. It turned volcanic ash from an unknown unknown into a managed risk, transformed procedures, and validated human ingenuity as the last line of defense. High above Indonesia, in the moonless dark of June 24, 1982, silence had replaced the sound of 4 jet engines. For the people on board Flight 9, that silence was not peace, it was dread. It meant the machine designed never to fail had been stripped to its bones, gliding helplessly across the night sky. Yet it was in that silence that the crew's voices carried. Calm, deliberate, never frantic. Instructions exchanged, calculations checked, decisions made with seconds to spare. In a crisis where technology offered no answers, the only defense was human skill, instinct, and trust. That was the difference between catastrophe and survival. For the passengers, memory of that night lingered in smaller, more intimate details: the smell of sulfur that refused to fade, the feel of oxygen masks tugged over faces, the weight of pen on paper as farewell notes were scribbled in the dark. These private moments of fear were woven into a public miracle, a safe landing against all odds. For many, those notes were later tucked away in drawers or shown to family members who could hardly believe how close they had come to loss. Each sheet of paper was a testament to how fragile life had seemed in that airborne void. Looking back, the flight stands as a paradox. On one hand, it exposed how vulnerable modern aviation could be to forces outside its design. On the other, it proved how resilience, technical and human, could bridge the gap between the unforeseen and the unimaginable. Flight 9 was never simply a story about engines, it was a story about people. 263 souls confronted with mortality, and 3 men on a flight deck refusing to yield. Its legacy endures not only in the procedures that followed, new monitoring centers, new training, new checklist, but in the reminder that no system is perfect. Nature will always hold surprises beyond the reach of instruments. What matters is how humans respond when the instruments fall silent. For Captain Moody, First Officer Greaves, and Flight Engineer Townley Freeman, that response was measured, inventive, and unflinching. They improvised a way through the unknown, carrying everyone with them. Their airmanship transformed a near disaster into a case study that still resonates in training rooms and safety seminars around the world. And so, the night the sky went silent is remembered not as the end of 263 lives, but as the beginning of a safer aviation era. A moment when terror gave way to survival, when silence gave way to lessons, and when 3 pilots showed that in the face of the unknown, calm determination can hold the line. The story of British Airways Flight 9 is a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary. It also reminds us how fragile yet resilient human flight can be when faced with the unknown, and how professionalism can turn disaster into survival. Aviation is filled with moments like this, where hidden dangers reshape how we fly and how crews are trained to face the unknown. If you'd like to explore more investigations into the events that changed aviation history, consider subscribing to the channel. And if this video gave you a new perspective on what happens behind the cockpit doors, leave a like. It helps us share these lessons with more people who care about aviation.